Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Christine Sampson. I'm with the Press Club of Long Island, and I would like to welcome everybody to our school budget coverage panel talk tonight. We've got this amazing panelist with me here, Sam Schneider, who's the Assistant Superintendent for Business in the East Hampton School District. I'll get to his full introduction in a moment. I wanted to let you know that tonight our topic is exploring something that impacts entire communities of taxpayers, teachers, students, and families, and with millions of dollars at stake in budgets. So this is what we're going to talk about. Like I said, my name is Chrissy Sampson. I'm a print and TV reporter based in Southampton. The first district I ever covered was Roosevelt during the days leading up to state receivership when the state was managing its finances. And since then, I've covered education for 5 different media outlets over the last 20 years. And here's Sam Schneider, the Assistant Superintendent for Business in East Hampton. He also works with Springs and Shelter Island to assist in their business operations. Sam, in 2025, was named Outstanding School Business Official of the Year by the professional organization of his industry, the New York State Association of School Business Officials. He spent a few years after college and during law school working as a reporter for weekly and daily newspapers. I love this. He's one of us. When not calculating school budgets, Sam is a devoted and long-suffering fan of the New York Mets. He lives in West Hampton with his wife and 2 sons. So thanks for joining us, Sam.
Thank you very much for having me, Chrissy. I really appreciate the invitation.
An important note is that while this is being recorded as a resource for PCLI members, this is not an on-the-record meeting for attribution in a news story. So Sam is sharing our time here tonight, but he does not speak on behalf of the district, and he's not speaking for attribution in an article tonight. So if you wish to follow up, you should check with your individual school officials in the districts that you cover. Important note there. We'll have time at the end for questions, and at that point, you'll use the chat feature on Zoom to ask your questions. So let's dig in. The most common concepts you will encounter when covering school budgets. First, we would like to talk about the tax levy versus the tax rate. Sam, can you please define and differentiate the tax levy versus the tax rate, 2 different concepts?
Sure. Thank you very much, Chrissy. When I was, as you mentioned, when I was a newspaper reporter and fresh out of college, understanding the difference between tax rate and tax levy was quite challenging. So let me see if I can just break it down for people so that they can, demystify the process. The tax levy is the amount of money that has to be collected from the property owners of a school district to fund its operations. And that is a very important number. It's also really, in essence, what voters are going to the polls to discuss. Voters are going to the polls to vote on an expenditure budget. That's the amount of money is being spent. And what drives that expenditure budget is the tax levy. That's the amount of money that's being collected as revenue. The tax rate talks about how that money is collected from the taxpayers, and it's a ratio. Basically, you take the amount of money that has to be collected, it's divided by the assessed valuation, that is the value of the property, and then whatever that quotient is what people are paying in taxes per either $100 or $1,000 share of value. What's important to know is that school districts in Suffolk and Nassau County do not calculate tax rates. That is a function that is exclusive to the town. The town where your school district is located is going to collect taxes, and they determine the tax rate to determine how much to collect from each property. The school district is determining the tax levy, the amount of money that needs to be collected in total. And interesting to note that the voters are voting on the expenditure, that's the amount of money that's being spent. The Board of Education is the sole body that votes on the tax levy. And while the expenditure budget is voted in May, the revenue budget, the levy, is not approved by the Board of Education until October. I hope that differentiates those.
I think that I learned something. I don't even think I knew that the function of the town, right? So they're 2 entirely different things, but they sometimes sound similar and people get them mixed up all the time, right, Sam?
Yeah, so, townships, define what townships are. There are 10 townships in Suffolk County, East Hampton, Shelter Island, Southold, Riverhead, Brookhaven, Huntington, Babylon, Islip, and Smithtown. Those are the 10 townships. And those are political entities, political creations of the state. There are about 800 towns across New York State. Everybody lives in either a town, a city, or a reservation. And for the great majority of your reporters, your colleagues who are joining this evening, they're going to be reporting on a place that is situated. A school district is an entirely different political subdivision. Sometimes they have the same name as the town, but that does not mean they have coterminous or exact same boundaries. So I work for East Hampton School District. There it is in East Hampton Town, but the East Hampton Town boundaries are very different from the East Hampton School District boundaries. Sometimes school districts cross town boundaries, and sometimes school districts are entirely within one town. And those are also important distinctions to be aware of.
So just to recap a little bit, true or false? Don't you jump in, Sam. I want our attendees to think about this for a minute. True or false? Tax rate is the number that people are voting on when they cast their ballot in May. Tax rate. Are they casting their ballot for the tax rate in May? False, right, Sam?
Totally false. All they're
Totally
casting
false.
their ballot on is approval of the expenditure.
Okay. And so to express this in a story, right? I think the reflex of a reporter is to say how much is the increase and what it includes. But Sam, do you think it's helpful to go beyond the number to the why it might be increasing, and finding mechanisms for apples to apples comparisons?
I think those two things are important, but I can subdivide your question for a minute, Chris, if you don't mind. I think it's very important to not tax rates across districts, not compare tax rates from year to year, because tax rate is a function of two different numbers, right? It's a function of the tax levy, the amount of money that has to be collected on the top of the ratio, and it's a function of the assessed valuation, the value of the land in the district on the bottom half of the ratio. And when you change both numbers in a ratio, you can't compare the two. And so if I can, as an example, cite East Hampton Town, there are 5 school districts that have land in East Hampton Town. Their tax rate is very, very different. But it doesn't mean that similarly situated houses in each of those 5 school districts necessarily pay different amount of tax, more or less. Those are entirely independent. And so it's very important to not compare to as if there's any parallel function. You can list them simply for information article, but they don't mean anything when compared to each other.
And I think
and that's sorry, please go ahead.
I was just going to say that's sort of a consideration for fairness when we're reporting and we want to be fair, right? That is fair to each community.
Yeah, I think it's fair to each community, and I also think it's important for voters to understand. Where I work, the East Hampton rate is much lower than the Springs tax rate, which doesn't necessarily mean anything, although Springs voters then think that somehow they're paying more in tax than East Hampton in a similarly situated property, which may or may not be true, but not dictated that number at all.
And sorry.
No, back to your larger question. I mean, I think that a far stronger story is looking at budgets increase and not focusing on the end function of the tax rate. There are reasons for budgets to increase, and there are limit stories to be written about that. And I would encourage reporters to look at those things.
To just distinguish between tax rate, tax levy, and here's a third concept, the tax cap. We've all heard about it. Went into effect, what was it, 15 years ago, I think, Sam? Was it 2012?
Approximately.
Please tell us, what is the tax cap and why does it make our lives miserable?
The tax cap is a complicated formula, but in essence, what it says is that the school district cannot increase levy, that's the amount of money it collects from its tax, by more than 2% per year. Now, that 2% comes with a very large asterisk because there are a number of exceptions to that, which are worked in formula of how it's calculated. But, it was to limit the revenue growth Now, the problem with the tax cap is that while the revenue growth is slowed by it, it not slow the expenditure growth. There are things that are outside of the school districts that have it expenditures grow more than it can. The best example I can give is health insurance. Insurance is something that employers are, provide employees. Health insurance rates have gone up sometimes 10, 12, 14% per year. Have a very large expenditure increase 14% a year, but you can only increase revenue to fund that expenditure by 2% a year. You can see how you're going to have a problem very quickly. And so that leaves districts with the responsibility of cutting back on other expenses. Now, there are certainly strong arguments to be made that expenses need to be cut, but at some point, to boil a budget down to position of, if we want to fund high school as an example, this is what it's going to take. And how do we do that when we can only grow the revenue by 2%, but our expenditures are by 14%?
Sam, here's another true or false. The 2% tax cap is always 2%, as the name of the state legislation implies. True or false? What do you guys think out there? The answer is false, right, Sam?
The answer is very false. So one of the major exceptions to the tax cap law is that it does not limit the growth on capital expenses, which are usually the most easy example is the construction or reconstruction of things. If you incur expense to capital construction costs, that does factor into your tax cap calculation. And so last year, the East Hampton budget grew by the levy rather, I think somewhere in the just north of 5%, driven by an increase in our capital tax levy, the amount of money we have to collect to pay this capital expense, and yet we were still with property tax cap.
So a district could have a 5% or 4.5 or 6.27% increase, but still be within the tax cap because of factors like that are specific to your school district, right?
Yes, and you can also have a tax cap less than 2%, and there are plenty of districts counter that as their capital expenses decline, they actually have a tax cap that's less than 2%.
Now, we've heard that in the tax cap situations, there is a mechanism to override the tax cap by getting a supermajority of voter approval for your budget. Sam, can you tell us a little bit about that process? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So the tax cap law says that if you want to pierce the cap, is the expression, meaning collect, more in the levy than what the calculator would permit, then you have to have 60% of the voters approving the budget. Now, this applies to all taxing entities. So let's be careful here. So a town pierce the tax cap. Who approves the town budget? That's the council. So for them to have an approved with 60% yes, that requires, in the instance of a 5-member town council, requires, a smaller number of people to vote. I think that would probably be 3. But as for a school district, the budget is approved by the voters. It requires 60% of the voters to come out and approve the budget. Last year in Shelter Island, more than 50% of the people who were on the budget approved it, but because they fell just shy of 60%, their budget was failed because they were trying to pierce the tax cap.
And what I want to say is that all of these concepts, they apply to both Nassau and Suffolk counties, right? We've been talking a lot about Suffolk at the moment, but
Yeah.
I see some of you out there based in Nassau, and I just wanted to let you know that we rely on most of the same structures, laws, concepts, organizational structures. So information that applies to East Hampton and Southampton and Shelter Island will also apply in Great Neck and Garden City and Roosevelt and Massapequa,
All of that is true. There are some distinct differences when you go upstate. Um, my entire I've worked on the East End, which is why my examples I'm saying tonight always come from East End because that's where my real world experience. But yes, Nassau function in almost the exact same way in what we're talking about. If any of your members are working upstate, it's a slightly different system there. But in essence, for Nassau and Suffolk, it functions the same way.
A few minutes ago, when we were talking about tax levy and tax rate, Sam, you mentioned the term assessed value. And this was
Mhm.
another topic we wanted to get into tonight. Can you tell us more about assessed valuation and the different things that influence it and the different things that it influences itself?
Okay, I'll say with a big proviso that this is not a school district farm in Nassau and Suffolk County. So, it is solely a town function. As long as, I say that up front, assessed valuation is the value that the assessor of the municipality places on the property. And there are things that go into that. It's supposed to, understanding is that the value is supposed to take into account comparable properties, sales value, improvements to a property. How that all works, I can't speak with huge detail. I will warn reporters, though, that street value, what you would pay to buy a home or buy a front, is not the same as assessed value in most places. To add fusion to this entire system, most use a system of assessed valuation. They place a value on a property that's significantly less than its street value, and that is a function of how really the town has done a complete reassessment of all the properties. If you're lucky enough to report in Southampton Town, Elder Island Town, then the assessed value, same as the street value, because they reassess every year. If you report in Brookhaven, when I last looked, the assessed value is 0.3% of the street value, so 0.34%. You'll see a home that has an assessed value of $1,000. And when you look at it, you say, wow, that must be quite a dump. But actually, that is not, could be a nice home because the town uses this system where the number they assign is 0.3% of its actual value. And I should say that that number, that 0.3 number, changes every year. And that's a function of an office in Albany, a state government office in Albany called ORPS, Office of Real Property Taxes. They place this percentage value on each town each year in something called an equalization rate to allow you to compare. This is an important function if you're reporting on a school district that is in more than one town. You're
Like
reporting on a
Sag
school district
Harbor.
like Sag Harbor, Riverhead, or Eastport South Manor, or it could be in a school district that's in more than one county, like Farmingdale, because town uses a slightly different methodology of how to assess these properties, and ORPS assigns an equalization rate, and that allows all that to compare apples. That's probably a little inside baseball for most paper articles, but when you are looking at these as a reporter, you may wonder why, where these things mean. I
Mm,
should also say not all of my colleagues have the same philosophy about this that I do. I try very hard to stay away from things like assessed valuation and tax rate because it's not a function of the school district. There are schools of thought on this, and one is not necessarily better than the other. This is what works for me and what the Board of Education, the superintendent, where I work, are comfortable with.
So inevitably, Sam, you're going to get questions this coming budget. Budget cycle is beginning now. We are in it, right?
Mhm.
And you are probably going to get questions from reporters along the lines of, well, how much is, an average house going to pay more in taxes next year? How much are their taxes going to go up for an average house in my town, right? You always get a similar question, right, Sam?
Yes, I do.
And how do you handle that?
Um, it's very hard to answer because, first of all, I don't control what the assessed valuation of a house is. It's a function of the town. I also don't know what average is because that's a function of town. What I like to try to do when I have that question is I try to set a high, a low, and a medium value. I show what those increases are on a high, a low, and a medium. Other school districts may have more ability to say what an average is, or may not have an assessor who is willing to cooperate in that way. That I'm very lucky. I have an excellent partnership with the East Hampton assessors that are willing to work with me to help out this information. But it, what's average? Was it average assessment now? Was it the assessment 10 years ago? It's very hard. And in many towns, you'll have high-end properties that knock averages out. And so small school district where you might have some properties that, let's say, have, are on the shore that are extremely expensive, and then you have some properties that are more inland that are not. Those two things are going to bring averages out of the water and create a very different picture. What I like to try to do is say that this is what we anticipate the levy is going to increase as, and people with questions about how that'll affect their individual property should consult with the town.
That brings to my mind, some story ideas, right? And these are story ideas that I will suggest basically not as school district explicitly stories, but for instance, how does the frequency of your township's assessment process impact school budgets within the town? Like Southampton and Shelter Island might do assessments every year, but East Hampton does not. And how those individual municipalities, how those processes differ, and influence the various factors. Would that be a story that you would have done, Sam, in your reporting days?
I think if I had understood this to the level that I do now, I certainly would have done it. I don't know, 22-year-old me had that breadth of knowledge to be able to do it. But I think it's also interesting that different approaches in how the assessors work. In some towns, the assessors are elected positions. I know that's the case in East Hampton, Southold. East Hampton, Southold, I know off the top of my head. Some cases, the town board appoints a position called sole assessor. That person is an appointed civil servant who makes those decisions. I think all that is interesting to dig into and learn more about, not only for a story, but for a reporter's individual knowledge. And I think you'll often find people who, spend a lot of time in the weeds on this, who are, working for towns, who would love for the public to understand more about this.
There's also the idea of storytelling in different mediums, right? So we have print and online formats and broadcast formats. And I like to always think about visual ideas. So for instance, in a previous position I had, I got a copy of a blank tax bill from the East Hampton Town Tax Assessor's Office. And we did a piece on how to read your tax bill,
Mhm.
because that's just great knowledge to have, right? My parents learned from it. Um,
There
and
are a whole number of lines on a tax bill, ranging from stuff that we discuss all the time: school taxes, fire district taxes is the amount of money that has to be collected to fund the fire operations, town costs, police costs, and then there's some more obscure numbers on tax bills. For example, there's a line dealing with community colleges. When a resident of your town goes to community college, not in your county, you have to pay towards that tuition cost. And that's one of the lines that's buried on the bottom of a tax bill that people often overlook because it doesn't mean anything to most people. But it's on every line. A tax bill can also be complicated if a property is in a village, an incorporated village, and there are dozens and dozens of incorporated villages. Particularly Knapp County, I think, has more incorporated villages than almost the rest of the state combined. And so that changed that as well.
I definitely just learned about that community college tax line.
Hmm.
Mind blown. I want to talk about a metric that for me is the lowest of the low-hanging fruit and a least favorite and very unfair metric: per pupil spending. This, I'll get to my take on it in a minute, but Sam, can you give us your take? Is this what does per pupil spending accomplish? And is the answer anything other than zero?
I mean, look, I think there are people who like per pupil spending because it's a quick and easy way to compare from district to district, but I think it ignores several important factors. The first is that when you have a district with a small student population, you're going to have a high per pupil expenditure simply because it costs the same amount of money to run third grade if you have 6 kids in it or if you have 22 kids in the class. That's the same cost. You're paying the teacher. The books are, a negligible amount, but you need the same electricity, the same heat, the same uh, oversight. I think it also is a very misleading number because it ignores the fact that there are some students who have special education needs that are very, very expensive. You have students who need co-taught classes, who need occupational therapy, physical therapy, speech therapy. You even have students who might need to go to BOCES because their disabilities are so severe that they can't be met in the local district. And then in most extreme, you have students who have to be in residential placements where they're often upstate and they live there full time and they go to school during the day and then they live much like a college student might live, except these are severely disabled students who need full-time care and attendance, and that's all responsibility of the school district in many instances. And so if you compare the cost of a per pupil expenditure in a large district where have class size that is large, it's going to be smaller than if you compare in a smaller school district. If you have a large school district, you also can um, make the most extreme examples of special education costs not stand out as much because it gets washed in with the rest of it. So I think it's a very misleading figure. And I also think that it doesn't really help compare, or it doesn't really help understand what the school is doing.
So for each of these concepts, I'm suggesting story ideas, but my hot take is don't do this story idea. Maybe there's a time and a place for it, but we're also strapped for time and save your time and energy. Maybe don't do this one around budget season. Um, there will be numbers disproportionate. And in my opinion, this concept will not tell a full story, but it will incite a social media war. We've all seen that unfold. So I would like to strongly suggest you consider with thoughtfulness whether you do the story about per pupil spending.
Or a story about how per pupil spending is a misleading figure.
Exactly. Yeah, that might be the explainer that does more legwork. Sam, what happens if a budget fails?
Well, if a budget fails, first of all, I think it's important to say it's very demoralizing for obviously the employees and maybe some of the more aware students. Students understand that budgets are important for what they do. I don't know that they obviously understand or care about the nitty gritty detail in the level that I'm describing it, but I think that they understand enough, particularly high school students understand enough that if a budget fails, a lot of the extras that they are very interested in, clubs, sports activities, are at the risk of being cut. So if a budget fails, the state law says that the district has to represent or has the option to represent a budget to the voters approximately 4 years. Now, the 4 weeks later is when the vote is. It means that the budget really has to be done within 10 days or so. So it's really hard to have quality discussions with the Board of Education and well thought out plans so quickly after that. You need time to analyze what went wrong. But so you have basically 3 choices. You can either not skip the second vote and go right to what we call a contingent budget, and I'll explain that in a second. You can have the second vote and present the same budget and hope that you get it passed that time, or you can have the second vote and present a lower budget. If the second vote fails, again, you are on contingency automatically. So what does that mean? It means that, first of all, you can't spend any money on equipment. Equipment has a particular definition in the law. It's objects, not services, but goods that are over a certain amount of money. And that amount of money differs depending on how each Board of Education defines it. It's usually 500, 1,000, or $1,000. Those are the ones I see most commonly. So you can't spend any money on equipment, which means you can't buy if you need a new bus, that's out. If you need a tractor for your buildings and grounds department, you can't buy that during a contingent budget. But most importantly, it means that you cannot collect a dollar more in the levy than you did the previous year. So you can't increase that levy at all. It means you have to make significant cuts to your operation because you pretty much are not going to be able to fund all the things you wanted to fund when your major source of revenue does not increase. And that's where it begins to negatively impact students because their non-mandatory items are on the chopping block. And it begins to affect employees because unfortunately, it almost inevitably means that are going to lose their jobs. And that's a very sad state of affairs.
We've had a couple of instances. You referenced Shelter Island, Wayne Scott a few years ago, where they were running in the red. They've caught up now. But so essentially, you still have to deal with some rising costs, right, of other things, but you have to make room for it because you can't raise your levy.
Correct. So, things go up there. The example I think that maybe I could cite now is life insurance, right? I think anyone who owns a home or a business knows that their liability insurance, their property and casualty insurance is going up. There have been tremendous losses in insurance across the nation, and I think if you own a car or a home, you'll see that personal insurance has gone up. Well, the district's insurance has gone up as well. We still have to insure those. So if that is increasing by last year, East Hampton insurance up something like 14 or 16%. I think as we talked about before, if I have to pay that increased insurance cost and I cannot increase the levy a dollar, I'm going to have to make it somewhere else. What is that cut going to be? Well, we have to offer certain things. We have to have students take 4 years of English to graduate high school. We do not have to offer an after-school activity. So unfortunately, that is usually the part that gets cut. Or, the education in a district might like to have kindergarten with 15 kids in a class. You can run kindergarten with 25 kids in a class. And so maybe they have to combine class, and a teacher would have to lose their job in order to be able to afford the things that you have to do, as opposed to the things you want to do when you cannot increase the levy.
Can I interject a true or
Devastating, not
false
just for the.
question?
Sure, please.
True or false? Kindergarten is a requirement in New York State. Does everybody know the answer to this one? My understanding is that false. Kindergarten is not a mandatory requirement at this time. Is that your understanding, Sam?
Well,
You're
I'm not sure. For benefit of my children who are watching, it was a requirement for you too. So,
I mean, obviously kindergarten, you want kindergarten, but sometimes things are on the chopping block that you don't want to be on the chopping
yeah, I
block.
mean, I think
Sports.
I think class, yeah, and I think class size is really great because I think that all the research definitely supports that, particularly in the younger years, smaller classes is more beneficial.
That is a
But
right.
it's not mandatory, and so districts will have to put classes together. We like to offer different foreign languages in the secondary level, but maybe you have a language that's lightly subscribed. Maybe you can't offer it, and the kids have to go to the one that's more heavily subscribed because you have a few more kids in each of those classes, and that's the teacher who teaches the lightly subscribed class. I mean, these decisions are no different than what I think make on a regular basis of how to afford. Is this the year I'm going to get a new car or a new roof? Unfortunately, what the ultimate effect that these decisions have is it affects children and their education, and that's what makes it difficult.
Now, when we as reporters, as well as community members, look at the materials that a school district is putting out there, like for instance, outlines at budget workshops or the budget newsletter, oftentimes in English and in Spanish these days. Um, what are some ways we can interpret, like use these budget documents, right, to create a picture. Sometimes there will be a three-part budget or a line-by-line budget.
Well,
How do we
everything is
understand the budget documents, Sam?
everything is driven by the line by line budget. That's what the board is adopting. And I encourage reporters to look at the line by line budget because that is, in essence, what everything else comes out of. The district also has to create what's called a properties report card, which is supposed to be a shot of what a budget is. The district is also required to publish what's called a budget notice that gets mailed to every mail in the district, which is another snapshot of the budget. The newsletter is not a mandatory publication, and a
Hmm.
newsletter is a summary of what the Board of Education wants to communicate with others. And it's certainly an important document to look at, but districts are required to have their line by line budget available. I always have ours on our website. I think on the website is mandatory, and that's something to look at. A three-part budget is a way of summarizing these three general categories of spending: instructional, administrative, and capital. I'm not a huge proponent of using the three-part budget because I think the most illustrative document, understanding what's going on, where those lines are divided is a little opaque for members of the public. But I think the best thing to do is look at the line by line budget and budget newsletter to try to have an understanding of where the district is showing its expenditures. It's important also to look at a line budget and understand what you're seeing. You may increase in one line that's very large. Why is that? Is it that the district is recategorizing spending into that line? That the district has increased staff because they're increasing a program in that line? There are usually very good answers to each of those increases. Looking at them without asking those backup information questions doesn't open that story.
When I was covering early on in the years of the tax cap, there was a controversial spending plan in the Three Village School District, and people were sort of going out of their minds because they're like, why are these teachers' jobs might be cut? We want to preserve the programs for our children, but the teachers are the ones, you know, operating the programs, right, Sam? Like you kind of have to look at the holistic picture of the budget and not say, well, don't give the teachers raises because we want our programs, our money to go to our students' programs, but the teachers are the programs pretty much, right? Like, am I
In many
oversimplifying it?
instances, yeah, in many instances, that's true. I mean, you could say, the French is the French program. I mean, without a French teacher, you are not teaching French. Uh, Not always the case. The sports program is not usually driven by each individual teacher, although certainly the cost of the coach is a major driving factor. Look, most of the budget is personnel and the ancillary costs of those personnel. And it's a little hard to differentiate in my program without including the personnel in that. There are very few things that don't come personnel function because we in school where teachers are with students all the time. That's how it works. And I think it should be working. So it's very hard to say we want to pursue the program, but not necessarily the teaching position. That's a tough lift.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was trying to communicate is that difference. Yeah. Um, Story ideas. For me, a line by line budget is rich with potential as long as I'm getting specific. So instead of a long catch-all article, I like to speak to a few specifics that make a district unique. For example, the community might really value athletics. Um, Maybe you look at sports spending over time relative to the number of kids participating. Maybe that's growing. Maybe you're adding teams, that's a driving factor in a budget in a community that loves sports. Or if you have a geographically large district where buses are always in need of repair or replacement, I would look at how much mileage is on the buses that are being phased out and, consider how many miles of bus routes the school operates. All of the numbers in a line by line budget for me have a story attached to them. And don't forget, you can use FOIA, Freedom of Information Law, because, things like bus mileage or the amount of money spent on football helmets, that's all public documents, right, Sam? Like,
Yeah, I mean, everything that's spent in public document, sometimes there are certain individual aspects that are not. And I just want to encourage reporters to remember that when you are reporting on a budget, you need to have sensitivity to certain things. If you're reporting, let's say, the special education budget, you're going to be talking about expenses of very needy children. And so use a element of respect for that story. Is you can say, in a small district, you can say, oh, the special education budget went up a significant amount of money because of a need of an individual student. Well, the public are probably going to know who that is because it's a small district. And so you can write about whatever you choose to, but I would encourage you to be sensitive to the fact that often children can be easily identified in these stories and to, they anonymity.
thank you for that. I really appreciate that reminder. Um, how much of a budget, Sam, is at the discretion of the school board? Is this ever expressed as a percentage of the overall spending plan? What kind of flexibility is there?
I've never seen it expressed as an overall spending plan, but very little of a school budget is at the discretion of the school board at the time the budget is made. So let's explain what that means. Know what teachers are going to make next year. Often a multi-year collective bargaining agreement between the teachers union and the district show what a teacher is going to make. So yes, it is theoretically true that the Board of Education could have refused to enter into an agreement for a particular salary increase. Okay. But that may have been several years ago. So when you're forming next year's, there is no discretion about what the teachers are going to make because it's been already negotiated and decided. And I should say, just as an aside, when you're talking about the bargaining agreements between unions and the school board, nothing can be changed in the contract unless both sides are in agreement. Board of Education does not have the unilateral right to cut salaries or to cut benefits. They need the union to agree to any changes. So you're making next year's budget and you know how many teachers you need, know exactly what that's going to cost. And there's real discretion in that concept. The discretion is maybe we don't want the optional programs, but if you want the programs, this is what the team is going to cost. Go a step further. Districts are required to pay into the state pension system for almost every employee. Well, the contribution rates are set by the state. So there's no discretionary spending in that either because the state tells you what the contribution rate is. You take the salary, you multiply by the contribution rate, and that's what you're spending. So the board has no control over that. The board has no control over the cost of health insurance. Again, a person could say, you should have negotiated a contract where the employee had to pay health insurance. Okay, maybe that's true. But at the time of the formation of the budget, those discussions have already been had and they've been locked in stone in the contract. So if you're going to have these employees, this is what the health is going to cost. And the health insurance costs are, in a district that I know, driven by a larger health insurance company. I don't know any that's self-insured for health insurance. These things add up to the fact that when push comes to shove, very little that the board can say, we want to spend less on this. They can't control the costs unless they want to eliminate these programs. Then you can control the cost. But the individual cost of program is pretty much already said and done by the time up to it.
We have a couple more topics that we want to get to. We're at 7:45 p.m. One thing that we wanted to talk about, Sam, is state aid. Now, didn't the governor of New York just release the projected state aid version for her version of the budget? Did that just come out?
Yeah. So what happens is the governor releases in New York State. The governor releases it in early to mid January. and then the legislature debates that budget, and they are required to adopt a budget by April 1st. In very few years have they met that April 1st deadline. Often they miss it, sometimes by a significant number. This has impact in what we do in school districts because we have to present a budget to the voters. The board has to adopt it, in mid to late April. If the state legislature is not done with its by then, we have to go with the governor's proposal in terms. This is the revenue that we can count on state to drive our operations. Now, in East Hampton, our state aid is a very small number of actual budget. We get about $3 million on an $80 million budget. But if you in Brentwood, they're getting a significant amount of money, hundreds of millions of dollars in state aid that drive their budget. It's dependent, and I can explain if you want how those things are determined. So the governor makes a proposal, and usually what happens in most years is that the legislature increases the amount of money that each gets. And there are several ways that can happen, but it's important to look at governor's proposal and then look at what the legislature actually adopts into law in April.
So would it be, those state aid runs proposals just came out. Is it too early to jump on that story, in your opinion?
I mean, I don't want to tell a reporter what to write. It's important to say that this is the governor's proposal and it's not enacted into law. The legislature still has to approve it. I think that there's a lot of ink poured on the changes in the way state aid is calculated, the way state aid is doled out to districts. You can do those kinds of stories. Again, you need to have a fairly firm understanding of the intricacies of it, which may be hard to summarize into a newspaper article, but I encourage people to go for it if that's what they want. But take the time to know it and understand. I think that the worst thing that you can do, and I could speak with some authority and being a reporter, is to write a story on a topic you really don't understand, because that just confuses your reader even further.
That is why we are here talking to the best of the best, like for real. We wanted to talk about audits, not necessarily as a direct function of a budget, right, Sam? But just the concept. We see them all the time coming out of the state. Talk to me about audits, please.
Okay, so school districts are subject to a number of different audits and auditors, and I'll just briefly differentiate the most common ones. The first is what they call the external audit. This is a function where a district hires an accounting firm to come in at the end of the fiscal year. The fiscal year begins July 1, ends June 30th. They come in at the end of the fiscal year and they examine the books and records of the school district to make a statement as to the accuracy of what the district is presenting in terms of its financial position. That's the external audit. Many districts have an internal audit. An internal audit is what I'll call a procedures audit, where an auditor, an outside body, will come in and say, how do you do these types of functions? Are there better ways to do these functions? Smaller districts are not required to have an internal audit. So that's the second type of audit. And the third type of audit or auditor is a claims auditor. A claim is when the district owes money to a vendor for a good or service. And the way that the law is constructed and the laws came about as a result of a scandal that occurred in Roslyn School District probably more than 20 years ago at this point, was that before any bill is paid, the education is required to review that bill to ensure its veracity, its accuracy, that the district indeed ordered a pen, for example, received the pen, and they were billed the amount of money for the pen, and they are paying the correct vendor for the pen. The board has the right to outsource that job to an agent called a claims auditor. So the claims auditor will come examine every single bill that comes in that's being ready to be paid to make sure that it is okay to pay it. So those are the three types of audits. Those are all mandated in state law, and the state provides no funding for any of those. So that's what you might unfunded mandate. These things are important, but they're not cheap. On top of all that, the state comptroller has the right to audit a school district in a wide variety of areas. And they come in from time to time and they will do a large look at all of the operations, then we drill down to one particular area of focus. And all of their audits, once they are made public, are on their website. And they audit school districts and fire districts and towns and counties and villages, and manner of other public agencies.
You mentioned a term, Sam, unfunded mandate,
Yes.
that I've been hearing for a long time and have trouble explaining it in plain terms to readers and viewers. Like, can you take a stab at that? Like, explain an unfunded mandate, define it.
An unfunded mandate, in essence, is a requirement of something that you have to perform, a requirement that the state imposes on a school district that it has to perform, but the state provides no funding for that. So the district has to spend its money to perform a function that the state is requiring, whether or not the school district thinks it's an important function or not. So, the easiest example is the one I just said, an internal audit. You have to hire an outside organization to come in and make an evaluation about your procedures. That may be a useful function, that may not be a useful function. I don't want to pass judgment on it necessarily, but it's an expense that you have to have, the law required, but the state doesn't provide any function, any money to pay for it. And you'll end up with a document that might be useful, might not be useful, but you're paying for it either way. So
Thank you for that. We've covered a lot of ground in this webinar, and we want to invite you guys, our viewers, our listeners, to chat in a question. So if there are school budget questions that we have not answered or that came to your mind as we were speaking, I encourage you to use the chat function to send us your note, send us your question. We have a few more minutes on our webinar tonight. In the interim, I want to mention that tomorrow afternoon, through the Press Club of Long Island, we have another workshop called How to Legally Protect Your News Gathering. You can look at pcli.org for that information. That is tomorrow afternoon. Tomorrow morning, Friday, January 30th at 11 a.m., How to Legally Protect News Gathering with the Cornell Law School First Amendment Clinic. I also encourage you to join our organization. We do not collect individual membership dues. When you join SPJ, what you do is you click the box of membership in your local chapter. That's us. And we do not charge additional dues to what SPJ will ask you to pay for. And our media awards is coming up too. We have opening entries for our annual contest celebrating the best of the best in journalism on Long Island in print, online, digital, and visual categories, as well as student categories. So that's a little bit more about PCLI, and our meetings are open to the public once a month in case you're interested. Anybody have a question here? The chat is open. Anybody can raise a question. And if not, Sam, is there anything we didn't cover that came to your mind as we were chatting?
I don't think so. I think what I would just encourage people to do is, feel free, approach the school personnel, ask questions. I know that sometimes people will be a little reluctant to speak on the record. I don't view it as appropriate for my role to speak on the record, but I'm very happy to explain things for people who don't necessarily understand the intricacies, because we are dealing with public money in everything that we do, and it's important to me that the public has confidence in our operation. And if I can help demystify the process, I'm happy to do that. So,
thank you, Sam. We did get a question. The question is not necessarily specific to school budgets, but will school districts be forced to consolidate as populations shrink? Is that a budget type of question? Does it make sense?
it can be a budget question.
Okay.
Look, district consolidation is very difficult because you have to equalize the assets of each district. And I think that, we saw that a number of years ago with Eastport South Manor in how those two districts combine. And we see it now in Southampton and Tuckahoe as they are contemplating combining. What we have been doing quite extensively in East Hampton is intermunicipal agreements, where other districts will contract with us to provide services that they can't necessarily do on their own in a cost-effective way. And this has the effect of saving money for their taxpayers, saving money for our taxpayers, and being able to accomplish things that otherwise wouldn't be accomplished. And I'm a big proponent of shared services because I think they're relatively easy to undertake, whereas a consolidation of districts is very difficult to handle and requires the will of the voters in two different districts who often may not agree. Requires a combination of cultures of different districts, which may be very hard, but an intermunicipal agreement can often accomplish the very same things that a consolidation would, and can be done much easier.
That's a great example, Sam. The intermunicipal agreements can be for sports. It can be for personnel. Like, didn't Mattituck and Cutchogue and Southold share a superintendent for a while? Am I correct in that? There was,
I think it was Southold and Greenport. They shared a
oh, sure.
superintendent. The example I'll give you is, you mentioned that in the beginning of your introduction, I am the assistant superintendent for business in East Hampton, but East Hampton contracts with Springs for me to provide services as their business official as well. And I work with their treasurer, but I help construct their budget. I help with a number of functions over there. And so they're able to have services of an experienced business official with a small amount of the cost that a different person would provide. And we do these kinds of things. We have our maintenance mechanics who are all really skilled in East Hampton. We contract with several other districts around us where they will go and perform maintenance functions, and those other districts are able to maintain their properties and not necessarily have to employ this mechanic, and we bill for the time that our mechanics are out doing that. So it helps us bring in some revenue and allows the districts to function in a way that maybe they wouldn't necessarily be able to find their own.
Personnel shortages is another consideration with regard to that. It can be very hard to find an experienced school business administrator, you know?
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
another great example is busing. I mean, the best example I can give you is if you have a number of students from different districts who are all attending, let's say, a private school or BOCES Up Island. If you put everybody together on that bus and you pick them up as you're going to save money for all the districts rather than sending two or three buses. If two or three districts can put all their kids on one, that's a savings for everybody.
Great. We didn't receive another question, but we received another comment. Thank you for hosting this session on a very complicated topic that is often very poorly explained. Sam has done a great job explaining many of the concepts at play. Thank you. We did get one more question. Does an external audit consider the entire line-by-line budget, or does it single out a category? External audit there.
So the external audit is a review of the district's finances. It's not necessarily they don't examine the line-by-line budget. They examine the spending, the expenditures, and the rev for the year. So they're going to look at what have you spent, you plan to spend, what do you have coming in. It's driven by the initial budget. By the time you get up to the audit at the end of the year, you're not looking at the line by line plan, which is what the budget is. You look at the actual experience. I like to say that budget is an aspirational document that we create as a roadmap of where we want our spend to be. But what actually ends up being the experience at the end of the year is often different because contingencies are realized, contingencies are not realized. Sometimes things come up, sometimes things don't come up. So an external audit is looking at the actuals rather than the plan.
We could spend all night talking about school budgets. For some reason, it's one of my favorite topics.
Mine too.
We have that in common. we didn't cover bond referendums or propositions on the ballots. We didn't cover a lot, but what I encourage you to do is reach out to your districts that you cover, establish this type of great working relationship with your administrators there, and develop trust, develop a rapport, and that will really benefit your school budget coverage and all of your education coverage.
And
Um,
I would also encourage reporters to reach out to the New York State Association of School Business Officials. It's a statewide organization that business officials in school districts participate in, and they have people who help explain concepts if in a different voice or a contrasting voice than your local school district can provide.
Thank you, Sam. So our recording will be available on the Press Club YouTube account. We will post a link to it on our Facebook page. So if you are not a member of this Press Club Facebook page, I encourage you to join. Thank you to our panelist, Sam Schneider. Round of applause. Everybody have a good night, and we hope to see you at a future PCLI event. Thank you.